We'll be starting in just a moment. Thank you. All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Khara Jabola Carolus. I'm the Executive Director of the Hawaii State Commission on the Status of Women. We're gonna get started right now. There are folks pouring in, but we're gonna get going because we wanna be mindful, especially of the caregivers on the call, to get out of here at the time that we promised. So the Hawaii State Commission on the Status of Women is a statewide government agency that is committed to advancing equality for women. That includes anyone women identified, femme-identified, and non-binary, and primarily through shifting cultural attitudes about our value and our role in Hawaii. So we are really excited today to welcome you to RIMPAC Under Fire, Connections Between Militarism and MMIWG, or the International Crisis of Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, Two-Spirit, and non-binary folks. So for those of you who aren't familiar with RIMPAC, it is the largest maritime military war games in the world that occurs every 2 years and is hosted here in Hawaii. And I know we have many activists joining us, so welcome and thanks to you all who are doing the work and have been for years organizing around this issue in particular. But today I have the honor of talking a little bit about this issue with you, but welcoming a great cast of panelists. So, RIMPAC really spikes in the number of transitory people, particularly young men who come to Hawaii. And we know that missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is not just an issue confined to the man camps around pipelines in Canada and the continental United States, but is also a problem here in Hawaii, although it was not covered in the first national US-based report on MMIWG 2 years ago. So we wanted to open up the discussion to this issue. And, I think today there's really a disclaimer that I want to give, which is that if you're a person of color, and certainly if you're from the working class, it is highly likely that you or a direct family member have been involved in the military directly and served. And so today it's really important for us to make the point that it's not about blaming ourselves or our individuals in our communities, but really about talking about structural systems. Because if we can only talk about militarism or the commercial sex industry as a matter of personal choice, we will never get around to the important conversation of dismantling the structural systems. And so there's no better org to join me with to do that than AF3IRM Hawaiʻi. I think that we see over and over that the next big thing and the moral compass of our movements comes from grassroots women of color. And so I'm really excited to have a panel today of speakers that represents that. For those of you who don't know, AF3IRM Hawaiʻi is a transnational feminist activist organization. They have no paid staff, they have no funding, no grants, and are not a registered nonprofit or C4. So we truly have a group from the community. And just as housekeeping, I'm about to get rolling here. Our hashtag today is Protect Waters, Protect Daughters. For questions, please direct them either in the chat box or on social media at our Twitter. We also, if we run out of time, will be answering questions directly on our social media after the event. So with that, I'm passing off to Sarah, and I'm gonna mute myself.
Aloha everyone, my name is Tanya, and I'm an intersectional justice intern and researcher at the Hawaii State Commission on the Status of Women. And today the two guiding questions that will help structure our discussion for our panelists are, how do you connect to militarism and missing murdered Indigenous women and girls? And what knowledge will you be sharing with us today? And one really quick note, I would also like to credit the slogan, Protect Waters, Protect Daughters, to Ihilani Lasconia, who coined it.
So without further ado, our first speaker is Yvonne Mahelona.
Aloha mai kako. I'm Yvonne Mahelona. I'm the current coordinator of AF3IRM Hawaiʻi. I am a Kia Mauna. I spent July through February helping coordinate logistics on the Mauna. I'm from Nanakuli Hawaiian Homestead. I'm the granddaughter of the oceans of Anaʻo'io, the Kaya Uluins, Pu'uhele Akala, Ko'iahi, Makua, and Kulaʻilaʻi. I am the great-granddaughter of Lovena Lena Ala, who was married off at the age of 16 to my papa, who was a lieutenant in the U.S. Army and a World War II vet. I'm the great-great-granddaughter of Harriet Liu, who was an escort or an Ivale sassy girl around the time of martial law in Hawaii. I'm the great-grandniece of Princess Ruth Ke'elikulani, who resisted the ban on Hawaiian language by only speaking Hawaiian. And I'm also the great-grandniece of Laura Mahelona, who traveled from Kona to Ka'u, collecting signatures for the Ku'e petitions from Hawaiian subjects to resist the annexation of our nation and the overthrow of our queen. It's important that I name and honor the women and the landscapes that I come from, because it is how I affirm myself, my foremothers, and my land as sacred in a world that tells people like us we're disposable, and that tells us our aina, that which feeds us, is disposable. They all birthed and continue to nourish me, and it is because of their resilience and their strength that I exist. But I refuse to romanticize their survival. I want an end to all systems that keeps Indigenous, Black, immigrant women in the furthest parts of the margin, and that allow for violence against women to be normalized. While I was on the Mauna, we weren't just awaiting TMT machinery to go up. We weren't just waiting on National Guard or for the police to show up to arrest us. We were also witnessing desecration happen right down the road from where we're all residing. Our Pu'uhonua, or our place of refuge, is right next to Puhakuloa, which is now a military training center. We heard the guns and the bombs, and we felt the earth shake. We stayed up crying, or we woke up hurting for our aina. And so I want to honor Makua Valley too, which is on the west side of Oahu, where I'm from. It is the home of my favorite beach and mountain ranges. In the 20s, because of World War II, it was seen by the US military and government as a necessary military outpost for training. With planes, they drop bombs in the valley and in the ocean. There are still unexploded ordinances or UXOs in that valley and in that ocean. This was a fishing village. There was a graveyard there. There was a church. There was a whole community of Hawaiians living there. There were altars or ahu for the families of that valley. And the military used all of these for target practice. They shot the headstones, they shot the altars. And this was after evicting Hawaiian families from Makua. A lot of these families make up a big portion of the houseless community on the west side currently. And so I'll say again that I refuse to romanticize the survival of my people and the resilience of aina. Desecration of bodies and land cannot, should not, and will not be tolerated in this anti-imperialist, transnational, feminist household. So this next part is actually like an hour-long training that I made for AF3IRM, but I'm gonna do my best to fit it all into the 10 minutes that I have. But today I'm gonna talk about all the fucked up ways empire through hyper-masculine militarism has shown up in Hawaii and in the lives of my people, and how the desecration of our land is directly linked to the desecration of Hawaiian women and girls' bodies. So we can start at first Western contact. 1778, Captain Cook lands on our shores. He eventually also dies on our shores. But within a short amount of time after his arrival, we lost 90% of our population because of the spread of their foreign diseases. And at the same time, other countries are wanting to explore Hawaii. So they came to Hawaii because Hawaii was painted as a lone maiden in the middle of the ocean with arms wide open, ripe for the taking, or whatever it is that gross, ugly white men say. But yeah, they stole our resources and our land. They say they were owed the debt of Hawaiian sandalwood, whatever, but they were also at the time kidnapping young Hawaiian women and girls for sex on their journeys back home to wherever the hell they came from. They were offering money to the families of young Hawaiian women and girls. They were offering Hawaiian women and girls stolen fabric, fabric and shit from other places they were exploring. From Noelani Arista's A Captive Paradise, she researched Hawaiian governance around prostitution during that time. Through her work, I learned that a British ship captain wanted a young half Hawaiian girl to come away with him on his journey. Her father was white, and he was known to sell his daughters to foreigners. So this girl sought protection with Chief Kalaimoku. He was kind of like a prime minister for the Hawaiian kingdom. He was also Queen Ka'ahumanu's right-hand man, and I think they were also cousins. But that ship captain went to Chief Kalaimoku, and he offered him money to retrieve this young girl. And Kalaimoku answered him and said, she will not go with you without her own consent. So it's showing us that our ali'i knew that these foreigners were on like some exploitative bullshit. So in an attempt to protect the Hawaiian population, in 1825, they placed a kapu on prostitution. A kapu is a law forbidding or banning something. But the same ship captain ended up going to another Hawaiian family, and this time he was talking to a full-blooded Kanaka Iwi mom, a Hawaiian mom, and he told her, I will give you $800 for your daughter. And she said, I will not sell my daughter for your paper or your most likely stolen goods. I don't even know where they do that at, but it's not here. But yeah. And I think that shows like the difference between, right, Western parents and this strong, fierce Hawaiian mother. There was also another story about a warship, USS Dolphin, coming into Pu'uloa, or it's also known as Pearl Harbor. Ka'ahumanu knew about their arrival, so she sent out orders to that area that the kapu still stands. Not one Hawaiian woman or girl is to board any foreign ships. This captain's name was Percival. Percy Boy got really pissed, as I'm sure all of those entitled, exploitative white men were. And there was a meeting that he wanted to call with Chief Kalaimoku and Ka'ahumanu. And he told them, if you do not lift the kapu or the ban, if you don't lift the ban, I will burn down the houses of the missionaries that y'all are working with. And Chief Kalaimoku, this was my favorite part, but Chief Kalaimoku said, right on, bro, go ahead and burn down those white men's houses because I'm tired of seeing them. And to be honest, same. But yeah, so Percy Boy, he did. He burnt down the houses of the missionaries, but he also burnt down Chief Kalaimoku's home too. So a typical display of entitled Westerner who didn't get their way. So they forced it from the shooting end of a gun. And because of time, I'm going to fast forward to World War II. But so Pu'uloa, Pearl Harbor, was bombed in 1941. And Hawaii was under martial law until 1944. Now under martial law, the US Army seen brothels as a necessary outlet for military personnel. So prostitution and brothels were legalized and regulated. It was recorded that because the demand was so high and the supply was not, women in those brothels were servicing about 100 men per day. These men paid $3 for 3 minutes. But I think this is a prime example of like, this wasn't lonely men needing comfort. This wasn't sex that was wanted or consensual. It was literally military men throwing their change at Hawaiians, Filipinos, Chinese, Japanese, Puerto Rican women to get off in those 3 minutes. It was a literal factory line for sex. And you look at Hawaii's history with plantation history. People were being shipped into Hawaii to work on these plantations for all these sugar barons because they were working so hard for so little, practically nothing. A lot of the men who worked on these plantations ended up selling their wives to these brothels. I also wanted to mention that in 1941, when Pu'uloa was bombed, when Pearl Harbor was bombed, the brothels closed to house and care for those who were injured. And it was actually the prostitutes of Iwalei and all the brothels who ended up being cooks and housekeepers for the victims of the bombing. These women then had to care and labor for people who probably brought 3 minutes with them on multiple occasions. And this is how patriarchy functions, right? Patriarchy fuels systems like colonialism, like capitalism, like imperialism all over the world. It disconnects people from land, women from land, disconnects people from each other, and it makes our survival dependent on systems that largely disappear, murder, or work women to death. So women cannot be left out. They cannot be left in the darkest corners of the margin when we talk about defending the sacred. It is sacred work to birth and bring up generations. It is sacred work to care and love and nourish and survive so that generations after you can thrive. It is sacred work to bring each other and land back to life. Colonialism told us women were less than, and so treats us much like they do land. Once they get what they need, it's all power, it's all done, we're disposable, and they're out looking for the new fresh meat or abundant fertile land. So as long as militarism and empire exist, so too will our survival and our resiliency. I think that's a given, but how do we get to more than barely surviving? Because we deserve more than harm reduction. We deserve a world where our ancestral lands, our bodies, our keiki, our kupuna are revered and able to thrive. Transnational feminism is how we organize these destructive systems out of our existence. It's the knowledge of colonized women all over the world that since our oppression happens across borders under the same systems, our solidarity and fight for liberation should happen across borders too. So I'm asking today, will all of y'all stand with Native, Black, and immigrant women who affirm our existence as sacred, because harm reduction that normalizes patriarchy and normalizes the commercialization of our sacred selves is bullshit. Join us for liberation from systems that sell our bodies and land and gaslight. Our pain is mostly consensual. Mahalo.
Wow, thank you, Yvonne, so much. We're gonna bring on Nadine to talk about the connections between your stories and stories elsewhere, which was a great seg at the end. So Nadine Ortega is gonna talk about parallels between Hawaii and the Philippines.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for that, Yvonne. That was super powerful. So I just want to reiterate what Khara said, that, you know, militarism has affected many of our lives. But at the same time, you know, many of us are still currently entangled with the US military, but still recognizing that many of our lands and our ancestors have been ravaged by the US military. Violence against women for me is also very personal because it's my own lived experience, my mother's and my grandmother's lived experience. It's generational. There's a history of this violence. I'm also an educator and I teach about Philippine history and culture, and I see the manifestations of this violence on my students. And it continues to affect their lives. So I teach about this violence to make sure that our students envision a new future for all of us. So there is a silence about the intersection of militarism and sexual violence against Filipino women. Sexual violence is built into military operations. It's engineered. The number of incidences throughout history and all over the world reveal that it is the norm and not the exception. Access to women's bodies, either through rape or prostitution, is built into the culture of the military. Throughout history, sexual violence of women and girls was a tool of conquest. There are many incidents of rape of Native women and local women by US military personnel in many US bases throughout the world. This includes the Philippines, Okinawa, Korea, Guam, and Hawaii. Sexual violence is at the core of the formation and the continuation of many modern states, including the Philippines and the US empire. And prostitution is a component, it's a core part of that violence. Pro-prostitution lobbyists often frame prostitution, which they dub as sex work, as empowering and consensual, but their analysis, however, fails to take into account the considerations of race, class, history, and coloniality, that uneven power relations between who consumes and who must provide. I use the Philippines as an example where prostitution has been and continue to be used to solidify the subjugated and colonial status of Filipinos through the sexual exploitation of its women. Throughout the history of the US and Philippine colonial relationships, Filipinos have been trained to be colonial laborers for the US empire. But Filipino women specifically have been trained to provide gender labor. So that is through care work and sexual services. In the Philippines, prostitution was not part of our culture. It was introduced first by the Spanish through Spanish colonization of the Philippines. US colonization afterwards instituted large-scale prostitution, and this is sanctioned by the Philippines and the US. Then also a mail order bride system and sex tourism, which stems from the racialized perception of Filipino women as exotic, as exploitable, and having quote unquote savage sexuality. The construction of Clark Air Base in Angeles City and Subic Naval Base in Olongapo City created a base town economy to supply the needs of US personnel. And prostitution in base town economies is created to supply the sexual demands of men. Such economies are sustained on the business of prostitution and sexual exploitation of the most vulnerable segments of Philippine society. Again, women, girls, trans women, poor. One study reported that 55,000 to 60,000 women and girls were part of this industry only at the two bases in the early 90s. And this is a larger problem, but the data only has 55,000 to 60,000 women just for those two bases alone. Of those in prostitution in Angeles City, 70% entered prostitution as minors. Rape, abuse, murder, sexual harassment, drug and alcohol abuse, and STDs were a normal part of their lives. There's also a culture of dehumanization, commodification, and violence against women in these base towns. And there are many examples, and I don't want to name them, but there were things like live shows and like really dehumanizing, humiliating, sex-based entertainment for military men. And this is driven by the patriarchal culture and practice of the US military of normalizing such treatment of Native women and local women. And then US forces left the Philippines in 1991. They closed down their bases and their contract was not renewed by the Philippine government. But these base town economies evolved into sex tourism, the sex tourism industry catering to Japanese, Korean, Chinese, Taiwanese business groups, and then tourists from Australia and European countries. And they were again lured by narratives and images of sexually available Filipino women and the images and stories of by US military personnel during the Vietnam War where there was a growing sex industry. After 9/11, the US and the Philippines signed multiple military agreements, reopened military bases, and US servicemen returned, thereby strengthening the prostitution economies in these base towns. So with the reopening of the bases, a dual sort of economy driven by sex was created, both as a sex tourism and a sex-driven prostitution industry by the military. So since then, there has been an increase in rape and murder of Filipino women and girls, while US military personnel perpetrators are ensured legal protections for their crimes per the Visiting Forces Agreement. This means that the violence against Filipino women is dependent on power relations. The colonial relationship of the US and the Philippines plays out in the bodies of Filipino women. The US continues to exert power and control over Philippine leaders, economy, people, and land, despite granting Philippine sovereignty in 1946. This unequal relationship enables the racialized and gendered violence against Filipino women who are rendered not only rapeable, but also killable. And then there's also been an increase in the recruitment of women and girls for prostitution, where recruiters target poor rural areas where ethnic minorities and indigenous peoples reside. And there's also an increase in prostitution and trafficking for prostitution within the Philippines. And sources estimate that there are 500,000 to 800,000 in prostitution, and predominantly it's women and children. And UNICEF estimates 60,000 to 100,000 are children lured and targeted from the provinces with the promise of food and water. And lastly, there has been an increase in trafficking for prostitution of Filipino women outside the Philippines to work in brothels and sex-based services for US military personnel in other military outposts all over the world, but most notably Okinawa and South Korea. And I am going to share some of the conditions in South Korea because that's what I have data for. And that's where most of the data is from. So these have been documented since the 1980s, but they have been growing steadily to now several thousands of women. One report about the conditions in Korea stated that Filipino girls were locked in the bars and brothels every night, threatened with violence, starved, or given very little to eat. They were continuously surveilled through video cameras and packed into small rooms with multiple women. Another investigative report said that every Filipino woman they interviewed told them that they were trafficked for prostitution for the US military. And lastly, a TV expose in Korea revealed that the complicity of the US military and the Korean government in the trafficking of Filipino women in US militarized zones. The film interviewed US soldiers who acknowledged that they knew the women were trafficked and were bought at auction. It also showed US military police patrolling and protecting the bars and brothels. And it also revealed that there was a business relationship between pimps, brothel owners, and the military police. And the Korean government's response is deportation of Filipino women because they're treating Filipino women as quote unquote illegal aliens because allegedly the women voluntarily engaged in prostitution. And my last point is that feminist activists in the Philippines frame prostitution as a continuation of US imperialism on the bodies of Filipino women who bear the brunt of the effects of this history. Women make up the majority of those in poverty and therefore are pushed to enter and are targeted for prostitution for economic survival. Trans women are also pushed into the sex trade because of discrimination, and they have little to no alternatives for work. Once in it, though, women exercise almost no control over the poor pay, abusive conditions, social stigma, health risks, unwanted pregnancy and abortion, mental illness, and other effects. And that's all I have. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Nadine. We're gonna shift to JJ and Tanya, and without my commentary, here you go, JJ.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Jana Julian, and I'm a former member of the US military. I joined the military when I was 17, like my mother and her mother, in search of opportunities. What I instead experienced over the course of 8 years was misogyny, harassment, and sexual assault, as did many of the women around me. Femininity in military culture is seen as inferior to masculinity, resulting in misogyny, the objectification of women, and high rates of sexual assault. In 2016, almost 15,000 military personnel had been sexually assaulted. That number increased by 38% between 2017 and 2019. In 2018, over 75% of cases went unreported, and more than 25% didn't report due to fear of retaliation. The US military occupies approximately 800 military bases in more than 60 countries, including 5 on Oahu alone. A misogynistic and hypermasculine culture, the military assumes a sense of militarized masculinity in order for the military to function, impacting and shifting the environments around them and having effects on the women and land that have been occupied. With the military, American military's history of encouraging and facilitating sex trafficking and prostitution, gender expectations and misogyny in the military are directly linked to the commodification of women, trafficking, and gendered violence in occupied areas. Wherever there is a large military presence, there will be significant and parallel growth of the commercial sex industry and the trafficking of women and girls. And in South Korea, where there are 15 bases, women from the Philippines and other South and East Asian countries are trafficked or brought to the country under false pretense to fill the bars and dance halls frequented by American service members. On Okinawa, where there's more than 20 military bases, more than 60 military personnel have been in prison for sexual offenses since 2015, targeting women in the military and local women and children. The sex trafficking of women and girls by US military men remains an issue plaguing bases around the world and including bases on the US, continuing the troubling pattern that has persisted for decades. And that's all I have.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tanya Smith-Johnson. I am a former Navy vet. I am the great-great-granddaughter of many servicemen. I'm the first servicewoman in my family. I have a history of military servitude in my family going all the way back to the Civil War. So we're talking about, Black men who were enslaved who are fighting for this country. So I come at this, as someone who joined the military, for the same reasons that a lot of people, join because of upward mobility and opportunity. But my experience was different. Like many people who join the military, I think they feel that you're joining a team, that you're joining, that you're protected, that there's no way that we're harming each other. I didn't understand when my father, who was an Army Master Sergeant, told me not to join the Army. I just thought he meant that, you know, maybe, you know, the Army was a little bit too rustic and, you know, two boots on the ground for me. But I understood and read between the lines later on after my experience. And it's important to understand why JJ and I are talking about, you know, our experiences and what happened within the military, because sexual assault, rape, violence isn't confined within a base, right? So whatever happens within it spills over and out to the communities in which military bases are. So it's important to understand the culture within to understand what's happening outside of it, right? Little did I know that as a service member that there would be cover-ups, there would be threats, there would be retaliation for my experience. And let's remember that the cases that you see for us, the data, that's, you know, 70% of military victims don't report. So even with that, and that's not including intimate partner violence, intimate partner sexual assault or rape, which was my case. So of course, you know, we're talking about the commodification of, you know, women's bodies. And of course, like, you can't get raped if it's your partner, if it's your boyfriend. And that's what it was. And that's what I was told from commanding officers. I was told not to ruin his career, not to ruin the upward mobility of, you know, a future officer. It took, what did bring some justice was not the simple fact that I experienced sexual violence, but that he missed ship's movement, that he didn't report to duty and he didn't report to work, not based on what happened with me. And so I ended up being able to testify against them because the military, you know, couldn't get work out of someone. And that was the opportunity where I was able to tell my lived experience and my story. And this is par for the course. Commanding officers didn't want to send them up for court-martial. This is the case for most people who report. They experience 60% of victims have some kind of retaliation, whether it's social, whether it's physical or not. So this is the culture in which, you know, victims have to deal with. Majority of the victims end up either being pushed out the military or choosing to leave the military because of their experience. And this is important in regards to just, let's look at the data, right? So out of 20, let's look at 2,600 cases. Out of 2,600 of them, 600 off the bat weren't even looked at and just dropped. Out of those, another 400 were considered non-sexual offenses. Majority of those were committed by people within their chain of command. So meaning a victim who's been victimized by someone in their own command has to report that rape, that sexual assault to the exact person who did it, and it's supposed to move up. Most of them are committed by commanding officers. So if you have a system which, for one, doesn't value team member, let's not even say like women, let's start with just a team member. If they don't value their own, what do we think is going to happen and spill out into communities, especially communities of color, because that's where most military bases are, because it's cheap land, right? So they pick these places because that's where the military can get the more bang for their buck, and that's where they recruit people. And these are the communities that are within the military. 1,500 of the perpetrators were put out the military without even the pursuit of a court-martial, meaning that commanding officers have the option to send them up for a court-martial but refuse to do so because they want to protect their own, or they want them to be able to go out into the world and still be able to work. So we have offenders who have offended within the military system who go out into community who offend and no one knows any better. This is not including offenders who rape and sexually abuse their wives, their children, family members. So it's in the why we're talking about this because we have to understand what we're up against when we talk about what happens overseas, what happens into bases where, you know, there are large groups, you know, of people. When most of these studies were done in regards to bases that are the 3 largest bases, and we're seeing an uptick of 6% in the last 2 years. And so the next report will happen in 2020. So what we should be prepared for the expectation of that to be even higher, especially in the era of COVID-19 where people have to stay in place. Here in Hawaii, the military stays in place till June 30th. So offenders are on bases, offenders are in their homes, offenders have nowhere to go and nothing to do but to abuse their fellow soldiers, their fellow spouses, and their fellow partners. They have nothing to do but to go out to community and to take that same kind of abuse to people within the community. Thank you for listening to, you know, JJ and I's lived experience as women of color. It's particularly an intersection of all those things, right? Not only is it authority, not only is it power dynamics, but it's also, you know, racialized as well. So, and that's all I have.
Thank you, Tanya, so much for sharing. So I'm going to be speaking just for a minute here, and I wanted to first pause because I know that we're throwing a lot of terms around like sex trafficking and prostitution and militarism and feminism, and just define a little bit and talk about why they're so important to what we're addressing today. So, you know, one of the first knocks that I get is, oh, you're conflating, you know, prostitution and sex trafficking. So just to kind of explain before I go into the contemporary issue of militarism's impact on women today, I think the easiest way to break it down that was framed by an organization called Rights for Girls is that sex trafficking is the means and prostitution is the ends. So the bigger umbrella system is the commercial sex industry, which is tied deeply with militarism, as Yvonne and Nadine kind of explained. And so it wasn't until 2005, in fact, that sex buying was prohibited by the Department of Defense officially. So this is actually very new, some of these policies that have come into place after a very long history of pattern and practice and custom. So when it comes to sex trafficking, right, force, fraud, and coercion are needed if you're an adult. But it also includes buyers. However, according to federal law, if you are under 18, if you've been solicited to have sex for something of value, shelter, food, cash, drugs, that is sex trafficking, even if you don't have a pimp. So even if there's no trafficker. So the states are catching up. And some states are more behind than others, like Hawaii, where there's still terms being used like child prostitute or child sex worker, when in fact that is not in alignment with the current definition under the law, and also with progressive movements understanding exploitation more broadly. So the reason why we're going to be focusing on sex trafficking during this little bit, and not people who it worked out for, right? Because there are people who actually do find prostitution empowering. You know, we know them. Some of them are our sisters. And there are people who find military service empowering, right? Or at times it was empowering. Maybe later, after exiting, a new lens comes into play. But we are not going to be centering the most privileged in the system or those who it worked out for. Social justice calls us to center those most impacted and most vulnerable. And so that's why we're focusing on missing and murdered Native women, immigrant women, and the issue of sex trafficking. So well before I came into this position, there was community outcry about RIMPAC increasing criminality across the board. You have tens of thousands of young men, majority, overwhelmingly men, from all over the world coming with bongo bucks to spend and ideas about Hawaii and Hawaiian and local women in particular, wanting to have a good time. And so there was already outcry, but there was no data. And up until recently, there was no data of much data available on sexual assault or domestic violence, and women's stories weren't enough. Women's voices weren't enough. So I'm just going to talk about that starting point because just 2.5 years ago, where we were was sex trafficking isn't really happening in Hawaii. Are you really sure it's happening? This is probably not a real problem and just hyperbole. And so we wanted to be really deliberate in answering these questions and figure out what's really going on. And the reason that sex trafficking and MMIWG come together, the intersection, is because there's just not enough supply. There's not enough women who are willing to voluntarily place. And unfortunately, this issue, it happens to be human beings. And so the impact is really extreme. So where we started 2 years ago, the Commission on the Status of Women partnered with Arizona State University just to have them do the research, not provide any analysis or recommendations on Hawaii because they do not know our local context at all, but to help with the technical side of measuring demand. So the point of our first study was not to prove that sex trafficking is happening. A lot of people read the title that the bigger project was called Sex Trafficking in Hawaii. And you know, especially those lobbyists who are supportive of the sex industry wanted to dismiss it off the bat because their point was this doesn't prove sex trafficking. I wholeheartedly agree. To be pushed in and, you know, go off radar into. Let's see if we have an economy that actually puts women at risk. And so what we did at that time was we placed a fake sex ad on Backpage.com, which was still open then. And we did it over a period of time on the same Friday on more than one island in Hawaii. And we measured the number of callers or unique phone numbers within a 24-hour period. So if somebody texted, a lot of them texted or called twice, we didn't count their number twice. And so this same team had partnered with states all over the US in large metropolitan areas to do the same exact thing. In Phoenix, for example, in 24 hours, they found 45 different phone numbers, most of them identified as men in that, well, all of them actually. There were no women so far in the study. In Chicago, 25 to how unique phone numbers contacted our line. I'm looking at the chat right now. 62, it was 407. The team had never seen those types of numbers before in any study that they'd done across the US, and the cities that I listed before had not been there. So the first question people ask me, well, God, it must have just been tourists, right? Or it must have just been all military. Like, can we just blame those two? And what we found, and this is imperfect data, was that 30% of those numbers were not 808s. And I say it's imperfect, right? Because maybe some military personnel changed their numbers to 808s. Maybe some tourists called from a hotel room, so that was an 808. But that's the estimate that we have and the best data that we have right now. And the takeaway from this is that this doesn't prove that there's sex trafficking. It proves that there's an incentive to sex traffic. Because if I went on Craigslist and tried to sell a couch and my phone became molten hot because there were hundreds of numbers of calling, I would obviously go and try to sell something more, especially if you are coming from a community where you don't have the same access to capital or you are interested in exploiting women. It's time really soon, so I want to verifiably large for a qualitative study, but doesn't speak to all of Hawaii, right? What we found though with that random sample was that 77% of the random sample of victims identified as Native Hawaiian. In the second study that we did, which we partnered with the largest social service provider in Hawaii, we found in just one sample we published this in January, but last year when we surveyed, we found almost 100 victims of sex trafficking who were receiving services at one agency, and 64% of them identified as Native Hawaiian. 33% of the child trafficking victims that were reported to child welfare services between 2017 and 2019. The hotline has only been in operation since 2017. So a third of them were Native Hawaiian. The majority of missing children that are being tracked by the State Attorney General's Missing Child Center in Hawaii are Native Hawaiian girls. And Native Hawaiian children are at a higher risk of sex trafficking compared to other groups because they are overly represented as runaway youth. And so it's really interesting because the definition of missing, right, depends on, like HPD would consider them runaways. And traffickers are wise to this. So, you know, they will buy the ticket and say, hey, well, you took the plane ticket that I got. Even though that child has nowhere to go, they're running from an abusive situation, they're already in an emotionally and physically bound and violent relationship with an older man. But they know that if they make it look like a kidnapping or abduction, the consequences could be really serious. So it might look and smell voluntary to someone who doesn't understand this issue at all, but a child taking a plane ticket and going to Alaska or California, which happens in Hawaii, Native Hawaiian girls, that is considered missing, not just as an activist, but also from the State Attorney General's perspective. And I have a good seg to end because that's Laguna. So I'm passing it over to Alex. Thank you so much, everyone, for hearing.
Militarism rips daughters from their mothers while awarding money to those who bomb the land where our ancestors lay. Militarism attempts to convince our very cousins that there is a war to be waged against their own people, even if it's not today. It convinces us, shackles us, and devours our homes, and it leaves our beloved daughters, sisters, mothers, nieces, and aunties lost at the hands of the US empire, their fates forever unknown. Abigail Echo Hawk reminds us that the land holds women that we could not. But we deserve to stand beside our sisters hand in hand, fighting for each other, our future, and for the protection of our homeland. We will hold our sisters by holding accountable the military prostitution complex that devastates our world. Aloha, my name is Sarah Michal Hamid, and I am the first daughter of 7 generations that has not experienced violent displacement at the hand of militaries. And while I intend to be the last, I can't guarantee the same for my cousins, aunties, and elders who are still victims of the US imperialist and military empire. 2010 was dubbed the year of the drone strike, and the next year, in 2011, Osama bin Laden was killed. And while the United States celebrated, my people mourned. Not because we celebrated him, but because we celebrated our people who got polio at the hands of the US empire and bombed at the hands of the US empire. What many people don't know is that the US military set up fake polio vaccination clinics in Pakistan to gain access to the genetic relatives of Osama bin Laden. What does this mean? It means that hundreds of my kin, the very people whose blood tells the same story as mine, the story of our ancestors, our rivers, and our families, trusted the US government to protect them against a horrible disease. And they were betrayed. But that's not enough because the same year they continued to bomb our people. Militarism to me means that my cousins, sisters, and aunties live yet again under another colonial empire, much like the British, but they don't want our tea or spices anymore. They want everything. The first sex trafficker to set foot in the Americas was Christopher Columbus. And while thank God he's no longer here to wreak colonial violent havoc, his descendants are. And one of the most lethal descendants of Christopher Columbus is the United States of America. We know that development projects and resource extraction has and will always be directly linked to the missing murdered Indigenous women and girls crisis. From the moment that white settlers began chanting Manifest Destiny, the expansion and development of Turtle Island began as a project to target land and women. Land and women, the land that births us and the women that nurture us. Land and women, because if we have no place to come from, no mother to come from, we then have nowhere to go, nothing to preserve, nothing to protect, and nothing to fight for. For us who understand that land and women, both integral to the well-being of our communities, are disposable to the violent, capitalist, patriarchal US empire, this does not come as a surprise. In Minnesota, one of the US states hit hardest by the missing murdered Indigenous women and girls crisis, the trafficking of Indigenous women is directly associated with man camps. Camps that host the transient workers or pipeline constructors that are set up and around during development projects such as pipelines, oil fields, and tar sands. A sister on the anti-Line 3 front lines, a tar sand pipeline expansion project in Minnesota and Canada, described the transient workers and pipeline constructors as polluting the land by day and women and children by night. The man camps that house the workers are at the epicenter of violence against land and violence against women. And with oil money drilling their pockets deeper into the flesh of the American dream, the same sister proclaims that women have spoken up, but their voices have been ignored. We refuse to sit by and watch our sisters be silenced. But what many don't know is that many of these development projects are directly linked to the US military. Just in the past 10 years, the US Army Corps of Engineers has spent billions of dollars on development projects, oftentimes funneled through private contractors. One of the most well-known examples of such projects that clearly demonstrates the nexus of militarism and Native Americans is the Dakota Access Pipeline. Nevada has not seen such widespread attention for the US Army Corps of Engineers project, but over $10 million in the past 5 years has been spent on water and reclamation projects, usually dams, concrete channels, and other means to urbanize water flow funneled through private contractors. The state of Nevada is also known for the legalization of prostitution in parts of its state, but what it is not as well known for is that it is in the top 20 states in the US with the largest population of Native Americans. Nevada also ranks in the top 10 states for the highest rates of human trafficking and sex trafficking. In 2017, Nevada's state sex trafficking rates were almost 20% higher than the national average. What most people also don't know is that 3 of the largest US military training bases are located in the state of Nevada. The largest military training base is located in Mineral County, one of the 11 counties in Nevada where prostitution and brothels are legal. In Mineral County, the highest rated brothel on Yelp is called Wildcat Ranch Brothel, where the website proudly declares, quote, "Sitting next to the highway means that we love our truckers. We have free overnight parking for truckers and RVs in our giant lot, as well as free showers, free coffee, and free Wi-Fi for any road-weary travelers that pass by." These rural brothels in Nevada have been referred to the military as hog ranches for the past 200 years or so. In 1998, the Yale Journal of Law and Feminism, an esteemed and foundational journal that is supposed to be on the cutting edge of law and feminism, published an article about sex work in Nevada. The article described the hog ranches historically and only employing Native Americans, quote, "Native Americans and slaves or former slaves, because they were not able to successfully challenge men's sexual advances." Yeah. In the same article, describing very intimately the skewed power dynamic between these trafficked women and their customers, and acknowledging that these power dynamics have not improved and have only been magnified, the author calls for the full decriminalization of the sex trade. The reason why brothels like Wildcat Ranch Brothel still exist today and largely serve a military population is because the authors like this have normalized the exploitation and violence against our Native sisters. The other 2 military bases in Nevada are located in counties that run defunct brothels, otherwise known as red light districts. In 2019, Nevada reported 124 cases of human trafficking, and over 100 of those cases were of sex trafficking. We know that these statistics do not necessarily represent reality, as so many of our cases go unreported and under-investigated. And we know that all of our sisters are not represented in these statistics, because if they were, we would not see a mainstream feminist movement supporting sex work. Because if liberal feminists knew that 92% of Native women in the sex trade in Minnesota reported being raped and sexually exploited while in prostitution, then they would change their stance. The National Resource Center on Domestic Violence released a report about colonization, the sex trade, and Native women. And in it, they said missing and murdered Indigenous women is incompatible with a term like sex work. This system of exploitation cannot theoretically or literally, in the form of women's lived lives, be split into two categories of prostitution and sex trafficking. There cannot be any separation in a system that serves the same interest: capitalist, white supremacist patriarchy. Because as one Native survivor who was trafficked in Nevada once said, "I never woke up and said, I want to be a prostitute. I was forced and manipulated and abused to do those things." These same experiences are found amongst women who are sex trafficked during RIMPAC. Thousands of international servicemen come to Hawaii and take as much as they can from Aina, and they take even more from women and girls. And while their stories may never be told in mainstream media, we know these stories to be true, because while to some, these women and girls may be merely a statistic, to us, they are our sisters. We live in a culture that disrespects the very things that give us life, and I refuse to sit idly by as our sisters, our rivers, our nieces, our elders, and our mountains are harmed. We will not allow another sister to be stolen. We demand feminist liberation and accountability now. And with that, I'm gonna pass the mic to my sister, Alex.
Oh, goodness. Thank you so much, Sarah. I just need to ground after that. It makes my heart so heavy to address these realities, you know? Oh my goodness. Okay. My name is Alexandra Balgos. I'm a young feminist and lifelong student with the AF3IRM School of Transnational Feminism. My family immigrated from the Philippines through the US military in the 70s from the province of Pampanga that houses US Clark Air Force Base. Military presence has shaped the values of my family, both in the homeland and in my immediate household, so I've been intimately affected by this issue. I'm so honored and grateful to be on this panel with my sisters, sharing our visions for the future. So, what does the feminist future look like? We outline the problems of our past and present in order to move forward using our imagination to envision the feminist future we deserve. So, the foundation of the new feminist world must require that both land and women be revered and defended as sacred. Ending the exploitative and patriarchal practice of invading the bodies of both land and women is imperative to our freedom and the freedom of generations to follow. True liberation looks like toppling the current racist structures of patriarchy and capitalism that have ravaged the lives of my family, my sisters, my own life, and our communities. Ending militarism and the commercial sex trade are foundational to women's liberation. The feminist future centers the needs of those that are most marginalized, whose voices have been silenced for far too long, centering the voices of Native and Indigenous people of the land that we organize in, most especially Black, Indigenous, women of color, LGBT, queer, two-spirit, Mahu people, immigrants regardless of document status, And we want to build regenerative economies that don't rely on tourism and the military as the leading industries. We will value women's work and end the gendered division of labor. Ultimately, mothering will matter more than money. We seek the abolitionist future that is not built on the backs of women. We want to follow a restorative justice model that creates a culture of accountability and community care at the center. When we say we demand justice, we don't mean this through the use of jails and prisons that are part of a carceral system that has criminalized women of color and exacerbated gender violence, but through community efforts that both ensure the safety of women and hold perpetrators accountable. And if our goals sound lofty, it's because they are, but that doesn't mean that they aren't possible and worthwhile. It's what we deserve, and we're organized, militant, and have more than enough energy to make it happen. We're big fans of the Commission's Feminist Economic Recovery Plan that serves as a really great entryway into this feminist future that we need. So I'll go ahead and pass it off to Sarah because she's really great at the details of that plan. Yeah.
So thank you so much, Alex, for sharing. And exactly like you had said, while some might think that our goals are lofty, we know that liberation needs to happen now. Wednesday, I got to host a Young Feminist Live takeover about the Feminist Economic Recovery Plan, where I discussed how it impacts young feminists who care about climate change, militarism, feminism, the growing racial inequalities. And I was able to highlight some key points of the report that address and seek to restructure and rebuild the disparities that have been created by these systems. You can check that out on Instagram. And as we're closing off, I really would like to honor all of those that have spoken today and all of those people that haven't been able to speak because they've been silenced by a world that doesn't see their stories as valuable and rather statistics. And in doing so, I think we're just about out of time. We welcome questions, so please make sure to use the hashtag #ProtectWaters, and tag the Hawaiʻi State Commission on the Status of Women Instagram and Twitter. And with that, I think I'll hand it off to Khara.
Well, thank you first to everyone who, shared with us your stories and opened up your hearts. And I think that the only, I credit the sisterhood that you've created to allowing for that intimacy and the stories to really resonate all of the theory that you are all building as well. So thank you so much for joining us. I think just my final words to everyone are, before the crisis, there was the crisis of colonization continuing to play out and manifest through, the violence that we discussed today. And, even at the commission before COVID-19, we've had women come to us who were literally selling their breast milk to men with fetishes, parts of their body that was just, meant to sustain their young, to survive. And that in and of itself is enough to say that we will never go back to that economy. We do not want to rebuild that economy. And we have a vision articulated and shared so powerfully by Alex and Sarah. We have a bold vision for ourselves, and it's doable, it's practical. We've learned so much during COVID-19 about where money can come from, the importance of political will and vision. And so we urge everyone who's attended to please follow the commission, talk about the report, have these difficult conversations. I'm the daughter of a military man and the granddaughter of a military man. And so, if we can have these conversations with our families and with each other and tell the truth about the most painful parts, it is what can shift the culture ultimately. So with that, also please follow and check out AF3IRM Hawaiʻi. I know they have a campaign, I think launching today around this issue too. And we will be in touch. Put your questions up on Twitter or on social. We'll also take them from the chat and be answering them. But thank you all so much for your time. And with that, be well. Goodbye.